Hello, my name's Mr. McGuire and welcome to this presentation on the eye. The eye is a receptor that plugs into the central nervous system, which we looked at in lesson 1 of this sequence of presentations entitled Nerves and Hormones. Let's make sure we're ready with the things that we need before we get going. First of all, somewhere quiet, free from distractions, where you can get on with the work. You will need some paper and a pen to write on. Now you would need one of the two things: a cup that you could draw around to draw a circle, or a pair of compasses if you have one that you can use. And you will need a pencil and ruler for today's presentation as well. Let's look at our learning outcomes for today. Then for the challenge, first of all, is to describe the structures of the eye. So we're going to have a diagram with labels on it that we'll need to know before we've completed today. And that's why we need some equipment to work with. And for the Aspire, we need to explain the function of each structure of the eye. So we're going to know what each part does. So let's start our brains moving, and we're going to look back to our previous presentation where we looked at nerves and hormones. So here is the cross section through the spinal cord, and then we have got the 3 neurons in purple, green and blue. You've got a minute to see if you can recall the names of those neurons, and if you can't, maybe look for the notes that you have done from that previous presentation. Okay, excellent. Let's see what we can recall then. So we have this purple one down at the bottom, which is connected to a sense. So it's called the sensory neuron down here in purple. And inside the spinal cord itself, with a couple of connections called synapses, we have the relay neuron, literally does what it says. And then connected to an effector, which could be a muscle or a gland. It's a muscle in this case, the bicep in the arm. We have the motor neuron. So label the 3 neurons: sensory, relay and motor. Let's move on. Let's see what else we can remember. So let's spend another minute warming our minds up. Here's a very simple question, I think. What are the traditionally recognized senses that you have? So I'll give you a minute just to reflect on those again. Very good. So let's just have a quick look at those. We've got sight, which is of course a connected with light. We've got taste, which is chemically orientated in our food. Hearing with sound, and then we've got a touch, which of course is a pressure on our skin. So those are our traditionally recognised senses. So we're now going to start constructing our notes for the lesson today. So if you could please put the title, How Do Your Eyes Work?, which is on the page in front of you. Just put it top centre. We're now going to spend some time constructing a diagram of the eye.
Okay, so using your cup, I'd like you to draw around it, but you're going to leave two gaps that I'm about to show you. First of all, on the left hand side I'm marking the top end of a gap and then the bottom end of a gap. And then round here at, I guess, about 4 o'clock, I'm also putting a narrower mark. Now I'm going to take that top gap, I'm going to join it to that lower mark, and then I'm going to reach around under my hand here and take the lower line that I've drawn and connect it up. Now you'll see what I mean now as I lift the cup out of the way. Okay, now a bit of tidying up is required just to remove the construction lines that I've got there. Okay, now I need a bit of an assessment because I need to put the lens into the eye, which is part that you may know about. First thing I'm going to draw in is a part of the eye called the cornea, which just bulges out slightly. That's where you put your contact lens. But then I need to know roughly where the middle of the lens is going. So I'm just going to mark that point very gently. Now I'm going to use the cup again to draw myself a neat lens rather than doing it freehand. Can't really do that with the cornea at the front. It's not got a big enough curve. You'll see what I mean again. I'm just using both edges. You can pause the video at any point just to catch up with this. So now I've got a nice tidy lens which is in the middle. Okay, I need to support that lens, so the next thing I'm going to draw is just 3 straightforward lines. These are called suspensory ligaments, and they connect to the lens and pull it, allowing it to change shape so you can look at near and distant objects. And they're connected to a muscle that I'm drawing now called the ciliary muscle. That's on both sides of the eye. I hope you can draw it better than I do. Now we need an iris, which is the eye colour part when you look into your eye, and this is a circular muscle, goes right around there. So there's the iris above the lens, and then the iris that's below the lens there. Okay, so that's the basic construction of the eye. Now it's time for some labels. Drawing labels is always a bit of a thing, so let's be careful to make sure we give ourselves enough space. There's a label for the ciliary muscle, which is suspensory ligaments. I'm only going to label one of those. There's the label for the iris. There's the cornea at the front of the eye. I'm trying to draw them as parallel as I can, really. Then the lens. Now I'm going to the back of the eye. This is the retina. I'll have a chance to label these in a moment, and that's the optic nerve. So again, pause the video so you can see where those lines are going. Thank you.
So we're now going to use your diagram. If we need to stop the presentation and just add labels properly, then please do that now. but I'm going to talk you through and explain the functions of each structure in the eye. I usually find that it's easier to do that going from the front of the eye where light enters through to the back of the eye where light leaves and goes to the brain for processing. And I want to start with this label first here, the first one as you move from left to right in the diagram, called the cornea. The cornea is a clear window where contact lenses are placed. I like that because it both begin with the C, it helps me to remember that, and it starts to bend or refract the light as it enters this front section of the eye. We then have the hole in the eye, the black hole that you see when you look in a mirror, called the pupil. It is a hole that's created by the iris. The iris is a circular muscle that runs around the pupil and changes the size of the pupil, as we'll hear about later in this presentation. It's the part of the eye that has your eye colour, and it has muscles that run like spokes in a bike wheel, and it also has muscles that run like the outside of the wheel in a complete circle, and between those two sets of muscles we can make the pupil get bigger and smaller. We'll find out about that later, as I've said. Then we come to the lens. The lens is supported by suspensory ligaments which are connected to muscles called ciliary muscles that can change the how fat or thin the lens is, which changes the amount of bending or refraction that light receives. The light then passes through the eye and is focused on the retina, which is full of receptors, and those receptors then are connected to the optic nerve, which send the data through to the brain where it's processed, allowing us to see. Now we're going to come back and we're going to add some information in a very brief note later in this presentation. So now let's use the information on our diagrams to label the structure of the eye and just accurately check that's correct. Okay, we're using those keywords from the bottom of the page here: pupil, retina, lens, iris, optic nerve and cornea, but we're now going to add and include the function of each of those structures. Okay, so we have an eye diagram and we have labels on the eye diagram, and we are now going to add the function of each of those parts that I spoke about on the previous picture. Now we can do that in one of two ways, and I leave this to you. You could put the table down as it is there, somewhere near your eye diagram, underneath it probably, or alternatively you could just put the functions next to each of the labels on your eye diagram, which may save you time but might not be as clear. I'm going to give you a minute and a half to do that, which isn't a long period of time, but you can stop the presentation if there isn't enough time to do that. So you've got a minute and a half for the table of structure and functions, or just to add the functions to your eye diagram, and if you run out of time, just pause the presentation. Okay, so we are now going to do quite a lot of revision work on the parts of the eye on the next slide, but just to repeat that if you haven't completed that work, you should pause the presentation now to allow you to do that. Okay, we're going to do a bit of revision now and see if we can get the structures of the eye into your head properly, no pun intended. So each of the words that you need to know is there with the first letter for you, and you've got a minute and a half. I will warn you that there is one letter on here that is new to you on the right hand side beginning with an S. And we'll come back to that when you have tried all the other labels. You've got a minute and a half to see if you can learn the labels that are on that diagram. Okay, let's have a look at the labels that we've got then. Suspensory ligaments, which of course are connecting to the lens and supporting it from the ciliary muscles that we'll come to in a second. We've got the I for iris, the P for pupil, ciliary muscle, CM, as I've said already, which are connected to the suspensory ligaments and to the lens that we've got. Now here's a new one. The outside of an eye is extraordinarily tough. In a dissection lesson where I would have students with a sheep's eye, for example, that they were dissecting, if you didn't have a new scalpel blade, opening the sclera on the back of an eye would be extremely difficult to do, incredibly tough. Got the retina, and then ON at the bottom here is the optic nerve connecting the eye through to the brain. If you need to repeat those labels, just rewind the presentation at this point and have another go, see if you can remember. But we've got a new label there called the sclera. Perhaps you could stop the presentation and add that to the diagram. It's the outer layer that's round the back of the retina. Okay, this is extraordinary, and I would like you all to understand and appreciate what this diagram is saying to you. This helps us to explain a little bit of the functions of the eye. You may not know this, but perhaps someone at some point said to you that you see everything upside down. Well, the reality is that the physics of the eye means that we do see things inverted or upside down, as this diagram explains. We have a glass in front of the eye, and if you look on the retina at the back of the eye, the glass is inverted or upside down because of the way that the lens works in the eye. What we actually see in the back of the eye then is an inverted image of an object that this particular diagram is showing us. So we have the tree, which is the right way up as we would see it, which through the eye on the retina is inverted or upside down, and your brain then is responsible for allowing your image then to be inverted so that we perceive the world around us the right way up. I find that quite amazing, and it's a good piece of information for you to share with people next time you're talking about the eye. So let's increase your knowledge. I've seen images like this quite often of the back of my own eye, because I go to the opticians every year to have my eyes checked. So this is a photograph through the front of the eye of the retina in the back of the eye, and this is the part of the eye that detects the light. The optician, very importantly, is looking at this to check that the blood supply is working properly, and also looking at the density of the receptors that there is in the back of the eye. This is the point in the back of the eye where the optic nerve is leaving, and just next to it we have as well the point where light is focused. So what structure in the retina detects the light? And the answer to that we need to know at this point is receptors. And what do the receptors detect? Well, we have to remember what the stimulus is for a receptor, and in this case the stimulus is light. So that's part of the structure of the eye, and the function of course is to collect that light to allow us then to turn it into an electrical impulse that travels down the optic nerve. So we're going to now look at a reflex, which brings us back to lesson 1 in this particular subject that we were looking at, which was entitled Nerves and Hormones. It's really important that we understand reflexes because they can be a sign that our nervous system is working well or not. So we have this idea first of all of a reflex action. So let's just go back for a second and look what that means. A reflex action is automatic and rapid. It's a response that does not involve a conscious part of the brain. We saw the reflex arc as part of the starter of this lesson when the question was asked, can you name 3 neurons? We have the sensory neuron, the relay neuron and the motor neuron, and they are part of that. There was one connection that went off to the brain, but that's secondary to the response of the body first. That's the conscious part. So that's the definition that we need to know, but we've revised that already. So let's have a look now at how the eye uses a reflex. The size of the pupil changes in response to bright or dim light, and this is controlled by the muscles in the iris. So we can see where the iris is. It's the part of your eye which has a colour, and then we've got the hole through the centre of the eye called the pupil. So as I've said to you earlier in the presentation, we have 2 sets of muscles inside our iris. We have radial muscles, which are like the spokes in a bike wheel, and you can see that they run from the middle outwards. And then we have circular muscles which run round in circles like the outside of the rubber part of your tyre, but there's lots of them running continued outwards. Now, working between the 2 of those muscles, that allows us then to make the pupil bigger or dilated, and that's a word that you will quite often hear. You can take and have drops in your eye when you have your eyes examined to make your pupils dilated. When they're dilated, of course, more light enters the eye. Now, the opposite of dilated is what a particular snake does when it kills you. It's a constrictor, and that means to close up. So here's the eye in dim light. The circular muscle of the iris is relaxed, and the radial muscle is contracted, which pulls the size of the pupil bigger, allowing more light into the eye because it's dim, and that then allows a better image to be produced on the back of the eye on the retina. Let's reverse the situation. Here we are in bright light. We need to reduce the amount of light entering the eye, because that will effectively kind of overload the eye, which is what happens when somebody takes a picture in your face and you're temporarily blinded by that amount of light. We don't want that on a permanent basis. So the radial muscles in this case of the iris are relaxed, and the circular muscles of the iris are contracted, and that then makes the pupil very small, reducing the light so less light enters the eye. Now, we're not making notes of this at this point. The important part is that you understand that there is a reflex, and that's connected with the pupil. We know that the eye has these structures, which makes this part of our nervous system, and it's a very important one of our senses, of course. So, progress check. Let's see what we know. When would the pupil dilate? So there's a picture of a pupil dilated. Would the light be bright or dim? And from what we've just covered, hopefully you would realise that it would dilate in dark conditions, so more light would enter the eye. Now, if you didn't get that right, you should now get the next one right. So in what conditions would the pupil contract or constrict? And the answer to that is in bright conditions, and that's so that less light enters the eye. So let's look at our learning outcomes for today's lesson. For our challenge, we described the structures of the eye. So if we were now presented with a diagram, we should be able to label the structures, and that's something that we'll need to keep revising and going back to. And for Aspire, we have a table or labels around the diagram that explains the function of each structure in the eye. We've gone slightly wider than that though, because we've then talked about reflexes and pulled it into the wider topic of nerves and hormones and the central nervous system, and we've looked at the pupil reflex and talked about how the iris is adapted with those two types of muscles to allow the size of the pupil to be changed. So let's look at our plenary, see if you can answer some questions. There's not many to go through, but hopefully you'll be able to do that now. So here we go. So what is the back of the eye called? I'll give you 5 seconds for each of this. Hopefully you're now thinking a retina. So there's a picture of the retina in the back of the eye. What stimulus do receptors in the eye detect? Now, an awful lot of people will say the wrong thing here. Please be careful with this answer. The answer is light. Do not say sight at that point, because sight is what your eyes are doing. The stimulus that the eyes are detecting is light, however. Okay, what does the cornea do? So for this you need to know where the cornea is on that diagram. Okay, hopefully you know it's the bit where the contact lens go on the cornea. Okay, you can see that light starts to bend at this point and then bend again. So the answer is it's bending light. A better word is to refract light. Nerve carries impulses from the eye to the brain. Okay, and the answer is the optic nerve. Question 5, when would the pupil dilate? Now it's going to be bright light or dim light. Think about your personal experience of looking in a mirror when it's been bright or dim. The answer is in dark conditions, because that allows more light to enter the eye. Okay, we have looked today at a wide variety of interesting structures in the eye, but also explained their functions. Hopefully you can now look in the mirror and explain what you are looking at with more detail and know some more parts of the eye next time you get your eyes checked at the optician. So thank you for joining with this particular presentation today, and I hope to meet you in the next one. Bye bye.